Hello everybody, my name is Benji and welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at my own footage of the Dark Lord fight. And I just want to give my honest review of Doom Eternal, Doom Eternal's DLC specifically, and just kind of address some things that I had a little bit of an issue with in the game. So, Doom Eternal, first of all, is in my easily top 5, top 10 games, which I'll probably make some sort of a video talking about at another time, another day, because I'm currently procrastinating a lab report. Doom Eternal is a wonderful game. It has an amazing soundtrack, it has a plethora of unique enemies and boss fights, and wonderful, wonderful sound design, wonderful, wonderful environment and game parkour, and movement and exploration. I absolutely loved every single piece of the exploration portion of Doom Eternal. The combat was a very interesting loop to get down, in all honesty, figuring out which enemies you needed to be able to focus and which enemies you could leave by the sideline while you dealt with the other ones for a little bit was a nice challenge and a very intriguing thing to learn, because I had never really played a game like this before where you need to juggle so many different types of enemies. I really found it enjoyable and interesting for a long portion of the game. This game is also very difficult. It is a very challenging game. It challenges your reflexes. It challenges your ability to focus during fights. It challenges your endurance and the speed at which you are able to make it through fights, and how long you can be in a fight without losing your sanity or losing your focus and ending up either dying or taking damage as a result of said blunders. This only became more abundant and more clear the higher up the difficulty slider went. So if you played this game on, say, the hard difficulty, which is ultraviolence, you're going to have a considerably harder time dealing with enemies and their ferocious attacks and the pacing of the arenas and fights that you have to go through than if you were to play on even the lower difficulty, which is medium, Hurt Me Plenty. There is a stark contrast between those two difficulties alone, medium and hard, let alone the Ultra Nightmare or Nightmare difficulty, which is the hardest one in the game. This game was fun on every difficulty. I played it through completely on Hurt Me Plenty. The first time that I went through it, I got used to the combat loop and all that stuff, and then I went through it again on Nightmare difficulty and had to turn it down a couple of times, but in the end, and at the end of the day, I beat it. And I used the Sentinel armor on the boss fights, which I'll get to here in a moment, but I did, in fact, beat the game. And I was very pleased with myself whenever I got out of a tough encounter or a tough Slayer Gate or anything of the sort. I would come out feeling very accomplished that, wow, my skills let me do this. My skills allowed me to do this. There were very few times throughout the course of Doom Eternal that I felt like the only reason why I was able to make it through the game was because of luck. That then brings me to bosses. Throughout the course of Doom Eternal, there is a couple of fights that you could consider to be boss fights. One of them is obviously Super Gornest. Another one is the first time you fight a Marauder in the Ark Complex. Obviously the Icon of Sin counts as a boss fight in that regard. There are a few boss fights that I'm probably neglecting to mention or simply forgetting. And I'm sorry about that, but the boss fights felt more tedious than they did learning and skillful. It felt more like beating the Icon of Sin and beating the Marauder for the first time and beating the Doom Hunter for the first time felt more like a tedious chore that you're finally done with, like putting off vacuuming all day and then getting it done and being done with the chore. That's what it felt like to me. It didn't feel like I had made some wonderful, amazing, great accomplishment. I didn't feel like I had my skills put to the test. I felt like I checked a chore off my list. The boss fights in Doom Eternal felt very tedious, very confusing, very luck-based. It depended on the attack that was going to be used, with the exception of maybe the Marauder and the Doom Hunter specifically. But the Icon of Sin felt more like I was only able to do this because Sentinel armor, because there's too much to juggle. I have to juggle his attacks, dealing damage to the Icon of Sin, and all of the enemies that he's spawning around me. I have to juggle all of this while getting hit as few times as possible, while putting out the maximum amount of damage that I possibly can toward the Icon of Sin. I also have to keep track of how many body parts I've destroyed and which body parts I need to destroy next. These things are extremely, extremely difficult to attempt. It's so hard and so tedious to do that it didn't feel good to beat the game. Not on Nightmare mode, at least. It didn't feel good to me to be finished with the Icon of Sin. It felt like, finally, I'm done with Doom Eternal. I'd never have to play this game on Nightmare difficulty ever again. I'm finally done with the Icon of Sin. I don't have to do him ever again. So, I wasn't a fan of that. The same thing happened in the DLC, which I'll talk about next. Now that I've kind of summed up all of my thoughts on Doom Eternal as a base game, I can start to talk about my thoughts on the DLC. The Ancient Gods 1 and 2 have phenomenal level design. The skybox artwork, especially in places like the Ark Complex, the Atlantica Complex with the burning ships and the tentacles underwater, even the swamp and everything else relating to that was amazing. It was so cool to see all of the artwork, and then the battle between the demons and the humans in the Ancient Gods Part 2 was phenomenal in terms of the skybox. I don't know why that happened. I didn't move my mouse. All of that was phenomenal. The new, unique enemies were amazing to fight and experience and work out the ways to figure out their weaknesses and the most efficient ways to kill them. The same thing that happened in the base game, where you focused specific enemies and figured out which specific enemies to focus, was so much fun. It was amazing to be able to relive that in a new DLC setting. The pacing was a little rough, I won't lie, but it is DLC. It's supposed to be hard, so that's not an issue, that's not a fault, that's not a downside, it's just something I'm pointing out. There was a lot more combat, it was a lot more tiring, all of that good stuff, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. The bad thing that happened in the Gods DLCs 1 and 2 were, again, the boss fights. That's the one thing that I will ever gripe about in any of the Doom Eternal segments of the game, were the boss fights. The Cubes boss fight in the Ancient Gods Part 1 was a chore, a bore. It was boring, it was so much to try to do, it was just so much more annoying than it was fun. And by the time that I beat it, I was just like, man, I never want to do this ever again. I had to lower my difficulty. I couldn't do it on Nightmare. I don't even think I could do it on Ultraviolence. I think I had to take it all the way down to Hurt Me Plenty in order to actually be able to do it properly. And that's just, it made me feel more defeated than it did anything else. There was too much to keep track of. There were too many minions happening at the same time as keeping track of the actual cubes and trying to be able to shoot the cubes in the weak point in order to have them fall to the ground and then shoot them toward the shield. It was too much to try to keep track of, while also dealing with all of the fodder, which you also had to keep track of. Similar things are happening here with this guy, the Dark Lord. As you can clearly see on the screen, there are 4 very, very high-level minions. You've got the Cyber Tyrant, you've got the Mancubus, you've got the Pain Elemental, and you've got the Baron of Hell, all spawning. And then you still have to try to juggle the Dark Lord himself while you're juggling these 4 high-level enemies, granted with less health, but still, you have to juggle all 5 of these. And then what's even worse is every time that he hits you, he does lifesteal. So you get hit once, twice, while you're juggling so many other things at the same time, and boom, he's back to the health that he had beforehand. As you can see right there, I did roughly a third of his health bar. And if I ever get hit another time here, that'll go up about half of a third, so a sixth of his health bar. And it's too powerful. You see here. There you go. It went up almost half of the damage that I dealt to him, and there you go. One more hit, he'll be pretty much at full health again, and all of the progress that I had made is completely and entirely negated. It was too powerful. It was too much of a punishment. That's how I should word it. It's too much of a punishment for such a small mistake that you make during one of the hardest things you will ever have to do in this game. You have to juggle so many enemies, and then if you just bump into him by accident, or he charges towards you and you didn't notice because you were in the middle of shooting a Cyber Mancubus, you're just screwed. It's unfair, in my opinion. I was not a fan whatsoever of the boss fights in this game. The Dark Lord is honestly one of my least favorite of all of the attacks, or all of the boss fights in the game. And the Icon of Sin was arguably my second least favorite. And then I'd have to say probably the Cubes was below that. It was just, all of the boss fights were more tedious than they were fun, interesting, worth it. Completely the opposite of all of the rest of the combat in this game. And there I just reloaded because he's back at full health and I'm almost dead, so there's no point in me continuing. There's no point in me continuing at that point. There's no reason whatsoever for me to keep trying to fight and play like when he's full health and I'm back to square one with a sliver of health. It's ridiculous. The boss fights were completely the opposite of the combat. The combat felt fun, it felt engaging, it felt complicated enough to be a challenge, but not too complicated to feel like an impossibility. It felt rewarding to be finished with a Slayer Gate and finally be like, man, I'm good enough at this game to finally be able to beat this super duper hard Slayer Gate. It's about goddamn time that I was able to do that. Thank goodness. The boss fights were the complete opposite. They were disengaging. I felt like I didn't want to pay attention. I didn't want to keep fighting. It was more of a nuisance than it was anything else. And it felt more annoying and more just, thank God it's finally over, to be done with, rather than, thank goodness I was good enough to be able to do that. It was a, thank goodness I never have to do that again, rather than a thank goodness I was good enough to be able to beat that. Overall, I have to say I give Doom Eternal a 9 out of 10. Not necessarily a 9.5, not necessarily a 10. Everything was so amazing about this game except for the boss fights. The boss fights were just they could have been so much better. Personally, if I had an opportunity to change something about the boss fights in this game, specifically this one, it would be the lifesteal wouldn't be so punishing. It wouldn't be as bad for you to get hit by accident. It just wouldn't be as strong. The cubes wouldn't have been as fast. The cubes would have just been moving around and occasionally shooting, rather than just moving around and constantly shooting at you the whole time. The Icon of Sin, it would have been more obvious what parts of him you had destroyed. There would have been less enemies on the ground for you to fight at the same time. Everything about the fights has something that I would change about them. And I can't say the same when it comes to the other parts of combat. When it comes to the Slayer Gates, when it comes to the secret challenges, when it comes to everything else and all of the combat and the loops and everything in the Doom Eternal base game and DLC, there's nothing I would change. They did it almost perfectly, in my opinion. Just hard enough to be a challenge, but hard enough to also be rewarding and fun. Whereas the bosses, I would change something about every single boss in this game that I encountered. Every single one, mini-bosses included. There would be something I would change. And that's sad, honestly, in my opinion. That is honestly super sad, because I really did enjoy this game. I really did love this game enough for it to be in my top 5, top 10 games. But there's still so much room for improvement on the boss fights, in my personal opinion, that I just wish it could have been better. I wish this fight would have been more fun, rather than annoying and a nuisance. But I'm not a game dev, so I guess I can't really complain all that much. But that's really all I had that I wanted to talk about relating to Doom Eternal and the Ancient Gods and my opinion on everything. So I hope you guys have enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed watching me take on the DLC and take on the base game as well, for anybody that's watched that or gone through the VODs again. Yeah, and I'm going to go on ahead and end it here, so thank you guys again for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.